Done a lot to keep your brother.
Keep the spirit alive.
What was John like?
I don't really know, to be honest with you. He was always so busy.
How much older was he?
He was 5.5 years older. So like when he was a senior in high school, I was in 8th grade. So it wasn't like we were hanging out a lot.
The light of comedy often casts the darkest shadows. For Jim Belushi, living in the wake of his brother John's meteoric rise and devastating fall has been both painful and transformative. While the world remembers John as the groundbreaking SNL comedian who died at 33 from a drug overdose, Jim remembers him as a brother, mentor, and troubled soul battling unseen demons. For 4 decades, Jim has carried this complex legacy, sometimes as a burden, sometimes as an inspiration. Now, as he builds his new life as a cannabis farmer, far from Hollywood's spotlight, he's ready to share the unfiltered truth about his brother's final days. The Albanian American Dream. Growing up in Chicago as the sons of Albanian immigrants, Jim and John Belushi learned early about hard work and ambition. Their father had journeyed from valet parker to busboy to restaurant owner. His Olympia lunch would later inspire John's famous Cheeseburger sketch on SNL. The Belushi household operated on what Jim calls an eat and sleep there philosophy, pushing both boys into activities outside the home: football, wrestling, theater, creating independent spirits with dreams bigger than their immigrant neighborhood. Jim was just a teenager when he witnessed the spark that would ignite his brother's legendary career. During an 8th grade variety show, John perfectly mimicked Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, giving a speech and banging his shoe. Even then, Jim recognized something special in his brother's performance, a magnetic quality that made audiences lean in. 5 years younger than John, Jim found his own path to performance almost accidentally. When a high school speech fell through, he improvised a hippie character commenting on Vietnam protests that captivated his classmates. Though he received an F on the assignment, that same teacher cast him in the school play that night. Jim describes his first experience with audience laughter as pure magic, a feeling he's been chasing ever since. For their mother, who had missed educational opportunities during wartime, her son's success represented a status jump, validation that their family belonged in America. While their father often stared blankly at his son's performances, not quite understanding the comedy, their mother embraced the women's movement and her son's achievements as proof she was, in her words, somebody. As Jim watched his brother's success unfold, he realized John had done more than become famous. He had expanded what seemed possible for their immigrant family. The well John dug would eventually provide water for them all. Brothers in comedy.
Did you want to follow in his footsteps?
Well, it was either that or follow my dad's footsteps. It was the restaurant business. And my dad lost his restaurant in 1969, or I'd be serving dinner tonight. So John actually showed another model, and I was so grateful for that.
When Jim first visited Chicago's Second City and witnessed his brother perform, he was mesmerized. He went back repeatedly, memorizing entire scenes, determined to follow this path. When he finally told John he'd been accepted at Second City, his brother's response was tellingly ambivalent, wondering if Jim might be more suited for drama instead. Despite his hesitation, John became Jim's unofficial guide through the entertainment world. Jim often uses the phrase, "When you drink water, remember who dug the well," acknowledging that John blazed trails he would later follow, from Second City to Saturday Night Live, connecting him with comedic legends who would become lifelong friends. Jim's arrival at SNL in 1983 came after his brother's death, carrying the weight of impossible expectations. He describes it as the hardest experience of his life, more difficult than divorce, with the iron bar pressure of being John's sibling on the same stage where his brother had become iconic. Yet the SNL cast showed unexpected kindness. Eddie Murphy, then at the height of his fame, made time for the nervous newcomer, looking him in the eye and checking on his well-being despite their status difference. Remarkably, Jim's first SNL episode was hosted by John Candy, who approached him on Monday of that week, insisting they build the show around what Jim wanted to do, an extraordinary gesture from a guest host to a freshman cast member. This began a pattern where Candy and Dan Aykroyd became surrogate brothers to Jim, especially evident at John's funeral when they were the only two who approached with offers of genuine support. Years later, Aykroyd invited Jim to join the Blues Brothers, allowing him to step into his brother's iconic role. Jim describes the experience as cracking open my chest, taking my heart out and massaging it, restoring his passion and inspiration through continuing John's legacy. He recalls watching footage of his brother's famous cartwheel entrance as Jake Blues with awe, commenting, "John always knew how to make an entrance." What started as a comedy bit had evolved into a genuine musical phenomenon with albums, tours, and a beloved film featuring legends like Aretha Franklin and Ray Charles. The night that changed everything. Jim remembers with painful clarity where he was when he learned of John's death. In the middle of a voice lesson at Chicago's Schubert Theater, preparing for Pirates of Penzance, a box office employee who had been listening to the radio came backstage with the news. Jim initially dismissed it as some prank his brother and Aykroyd were pulling. Only after calling WBBM radio himself and hearing the Associated Press report did the reality sink in. Most remarkably, Jim performed in the show that very night, the beginning of a lifetime of carrying on despite unspeakable grief. The details would later emerge. John had died in bungalow number 3 at the Chateau Marmont from a speedball, a lethal combination of cocaine and heroin. Jim believes LA itself contributed to his brother's death, citing the profound loneliness that can pervade the city combined with the unbelievable accessibility of everything, especially drugs. Within their family structure, John had become the leader, the most successful member naturally assuming the role of family head. His death was like decapitation, leaving them adrift. Jim describes it as throwing a hand grenade into a family, the shrapnel hitting everyone differently, tearing them apart in unique ways. The added layer of public notoriety made private grieving nearly impossible, with strangers constantly approaching Jim with condolences and declarations of love for his brother. The wound deepened when journalist Bob Woodward, whom the family had trusted to write a reverent account of John's life, published Wired, a harrowing portrayal focused almost exclusively on John's downward spiral. Jim described this as the true trauma of his life, feeling betrayed by someone they thought was a white knight, the reporter who had brought down Nixon. The family had opened up to Woodward, only to feel violated when the book emphasized addiction over achievement. For Jim, being constantly reminded of this loss became an inescapable reality. Everywhere he went, people would express sympathy or share memories of John, forcing Jim to process the trauma in public view, with no opportunity to hide from his grief. From trauma to purpose.
John was a legend, man. I mean, he was, there's no touching that. I'm just a fan. I was just a fan.
4 decades of reflection have given Jim insight into his brother's struggles that goes beyond the simplistic narrative of rock star lifestyle gone wrong. He believes John suffered from chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, from his days as a high school football middle linebacker, recalling a terrifying moment when teenage John had a convulsive seizure in the family's laundry room. Jim suggests his brother's escalating drug use was an attempt at self-medication for underlying neurological issues. His most poignant belief, if John had confined himself to cannabis instead of cocaine and heroin, he might still be alive today. This conviction drives Jim's unlikely second act, cannabis farmer in Oregon. The transformation began with what Jim calls a baptism, skinny dipping in the Rogue River during a visit to a friend's property. The experience affected him so profoundly, he purchased 15 acres of riverfront property, later expanding to 93 acres when neighboring farmland became available. After Oregon legalized recreational cannabis in 2015, Jim found his purpose. Despite not having smoked since high school, he embraced cannabis cultivation as a mission rather than merely a business. Jim now embraces the shadow of his brother's legacy rather than fighting it. When people mention filling big shoes, he responds that he likes John's shoes. When they speak of being in the shadow, he notes the shadows provide welcome relief in scorching heat. Now it's time to hear from you. What's your favorite memory of John Belushi? Let us know in the comments section below.